The most famous French neighborhood in America does not contain a single French building, not one. Every structure tourists photograph in the French Quarter, every iron balcony, every stucco wall, every arched courtyard was built by the Spanish. The original French city burned to the ground twice in 6 years, and Spain rebuilt it in its own image, with thick brick walls and tile roofs and courtyards designed as fire breaks. Then the Americans arrived, the Spanish left, and somehow the neighborhood kept the name that had nothing to do with what was actually standing there. That confusion between what the French Quarter is called and what it actually is runs through every chapter of its 300-year history. It is a place that has always sold the world a version of itself that is slightly, beautifully, profitably untrue. The settlement began in March of 1718 when a French-Canadian naval officer named Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville ordered 80 men, convicts, enslaved people, a handful of carpenters, to clear canebrake and cypress forest on a crescent-shaped bend of the Mississippi River. Nearly all the land along the lower Mississippi sat below sea level, but Bienville chose this spot because an ancient Native American portage connected the river to Bayou St. John, which led out to Lake Pontchartrain and the Gulf. Whoever held this bend controlled traffic on the continent's greatest river. When deep excavations are made in the quarter today, construction crews still pull up the enormous trunks of cypresses that Bienville's men felled more than 3 centuries ago. What they built was modest and impermanent. A September 1722 hurricane wiped away 4 years of provisional development and forced a fresh start. The present-day street grid was laid out in its aftermath. By the 1720s, the settlement consisted of about 100 bark huts, a small church, warehouses, and a house for Bienville, all arranged on a military-style grid of roughly 70 squares. The central square, Place d'Armes, now Jackson Square, doubled as a military parade ground and a site for public executions. The whole enterprise existed to serve John Law's Company of the West, which had named the city for the French regent, the Duc d'Orléans, hoping to curry favor at court. Law's Mississippi bubble burst in 1720, and the venture became an afterthought. In 1762, Louis XV, indifferent to the colony, quietly transferred all of Louisiana to his Bourbon cousin Charles III of Spain. Most residents didn't learn about it for 2 years. The Spanish governed for 4 decades, and for the first 20 of those years, the old French wooden city stood more or less as it had been built, flammable, low-slung, provincial. Then came Good Friday, March 21st, 1788. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, a fire broke out at the home of the Army Treasurer, Don Vicente José Núñez, at 619 Chartres Street, less than a block from the central square. Because it was Good Friday, the priests refused to allow church bells to be rung as a fire alarm. A strong southeast wind drove the flames through the wooden city. Within 5 hours, 856 of the settlement's 1,100 structures were ash. The church, the municipal building, the barracks, the armory, the jail, nearly every bakery, and most of the principal mansions. Colonial Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miró set up tents for the homeless and began distributing rations. Rebuilding started almost immediately, but 6 years later, on December 8, 1794, another fire tore through the same area and destroyed 212 more buildings, many of them freshly rebuilt from the first catastrophe. This time, the Spanish authorities imposed strict new building codes. Any new structure over 1 story had to be built of brick and plaster, capped with tile roofs. Buildings had to abut one another at the sidewalk to create continuous firewalls. Interior courtyards were mandated, not for charm, but as fire breaks. The lacy iron balconies, the thick stucco facades, the arched corridors that the world now calls quintessentially New Orleans, all of it was Spain's answer to France's flammable city. As the writer Lyle Saxon put it decades later, The city that fell before the flames was a congested French community of wooden houses, badly arranged and irregular. A stately Spanish city rose in its place. The Ursuline Convent, completed in 1752 and the oldest surviving structure in the Mississippi Valley, was one of the few buildings to escape both fires. Everything else that stands in the quarter today dates from the Spanish period or later. Walk down Royal Street and you are walking through a Spanish colonial city. The arched doorways, the thick plaster walls, the hidden courtyards with fountains and banana trees, the narrow carriageways that serve as the only entrance from the street. Creole houses had no interior hallways. You entered through the carriageway, emerged into a private courtyard, and found the kitchen, stables, and servants' quarters arranged around the open space. This layout, public face to the street, private life hidden behind, would define the quarter's character for the next 2 centuries. This is the architecture that survives. This is what tourists come to see. And this is the first great paradox of the French Quarter. The thing that makes it beautiful is the product of catastrophe, built by a country whose name appears nowhere in the neighborhood's title. In 1803, Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States for roughly 4 cents an acre. The Creole residents of the quarter, French-speaking, Catholic, insular, suddenly found themselves sharing a city with Anglo-American Protestants who had no interest in assimilation. The hostility between the two groups was sharp enough that in 1836, New Orleans formally divided into 3 self-governing municipalities. The French Quarter became the first municipality. The American sector across Canal Street became the second. Canal Street itself, 171 feet wide and running along the upriver edge of the quarter, became the neutral ground, a term New Orleanians still use today for the median of any boulevard. The Creoles kept Royal Street as their commercial artery. The Americans built their own business district on the other side of the line. What followed was the most extraordinary economic boom the quarter would ever see. Cotton was the engine. In 1812, the first steamboat arrived on the Mississippi, and within 25 years, over 700 steamboats were working western rivers, and New Orleans sat at the mouth of the funnel. By the 1840s, more than half of all cotton grown in America passed through the city on its way to Liverpool and Manchester. 3,500 vessels were steaming in and out of the port annually, carrying cargo valued at $220 million, roughly $6.5 billion in today's dollars. Thousands of dock workers toiled on the wharves transferring cargo. Hundreds of bankers, merchants, factors, insurers, and lawyers managed the logistics. By 1840, New Orleans alone held 12% of the nation's total banking capital, and the city's population had reached 102,193, making it the largest city in the South, the 3rd largest in the nation, and the 4th busiest port in the world. The average Louisiana sugar plantation was valued at roughly $200,000 and yielded a 10% annual return. Royal Street glittered with jewelers, couturiers, and importers of Parisian goods. The opulent townhouses that still line the quarter's side streets date from these flush decades. But this elegance could not exist apart from the institution that underwrote it. New Orleans was the busiest slave marketplace in the nation throughout the antebellum era. 23% of the city's population was enslaved. The wealth visible in the quarter, the mansions, the opera, the imported Parisian couture, was built on the labor of people who had no share in any of it. Into this peak walked one of the most remarkable figures in the quarter's history, Baroness Micaela Almonester de Pontalba. She was the daughter of a Spanish colonial philanthropist who had rebuilt the St. Louis Cathedral after the fires. She had married into French aristocracy, an arranged union that ended with her father-in-law shooting her 4 times at close range before killing himself. She survived, separated from her husband, and returned to New Orleans with a fortune and an ambition to reshape the heart of the old city. Between 1849 and 1851, she spent over $300,000, an enormous sum, constructing 2 matching red brick 4-story row house buildings flanking Jackson Square. She hired and fired the architect James Gallier Sr. before construction even started, then personally supervised the work, reportedly climbing ladders in men's trousers to inspect the progress. Those buildings introduced cast-iron gallery balconies to the city, the first recorded use in New Orleans of the ornamental ironwork that would become the quarter's visual signature. The Baroness had her initials, A.P., woven into the cast-iron balustrades. They are still there today, overlooking the fortune tellers and portrait artists of Jackson Square. A decade later came the building that may have marked the high point of the quarter's cultural prestige. In 1859, opera director Charles Boudouskier commissioned James Gallier Jr. to design the French Opera House at the corner of Bourbon and Toulouse Streets. Gallier completed the structure in just 7 months at a contract price of $118,500. It seated more than 2,000. Opening night, December 2nd, 1859, featured Rossini's Guillaume Tell, and the reviews were rapturous. One reporter called the building a colossus rising over everything in the vicinity. The French Opera House became the epicenter of Creole social life, hosting not only grand opera, but also the most prestigious carnival balls: Comus, Proteus, Twelfth Night Revelers, Momus. For 60 years, it would stand at the intersection of Bourbon and Toulouse as the physical embodiment of everything the Creole elite believed their neighborhood to be: cultured, European, refined. But on the streets just a few blocks away, a very different French Quarter was taking shape. Starting in the 1840s, a 2-block stretch called Gallatin Street, running from Ursuline to Barracks, near the docks and the French Market, became what many considered the most dangerous street in America. Gallatin Street sat at the edge of one of the busiest ports in the world, and close to 500,000 immigrants passed through the area in the antebellum decades. The men who worked the docks or stepped off arriving ships found a warren of brothels, dance halls, and bar rooms where the price of entry was free, but the price of leaving could be everything in your pockets, if not your life. Herbert Asbury, writing in his 1936 book, The French Quarter, An Informal History of the New Orleans Underworld, described Gallatin Street as a place where a stranger who entered with money and came out with his skull uncracked had performed a feat bordering on the miraculous. Asbury's sources, sensationalist 19th century newspapers, likely exaggerated, but not by as much as you'd hope. Prostitution on Gallatin Street was said to be the second most profitable business in antebellum New Orleans, behind only the cotton trade itself. There was rarely a fee to enter a dance house. The business model was simpler and more predatory than that. Men were encouraged to buy a drink for their dance partner at the end of each dance, keeping the bartenders flush and the patrons loose enough to be robbed or worse. The street was dominated by the Live Oak Boys, a gang named for the oak clubs they carried and the live oak trees near the river where they gathered. They hired themselves out to businessmen during the Gilded Age to commit arson and assault against competitors. Dance halls were frequent targets. But the most notorious figures on Gallatin were the women. Mary Jane Bricktop Jackson, a red-haired prostitute operating out of Archie Murphy's brothel in the 1850s, compiled a record of violence so extreme that even the Live Oak Boys avoided her. Her first known killing came in 1856. By the time Union troops occupied New Orleans during the Civil War, she had been credited with 4 murders, mostly committed with a knife. The police simply did not patrol Gallatin Street after dark. By the late 1880s, the Live Oak Boys were mostly dead or imprisoned, and in 1897, when the city ordinance creating Storyville required all brothels to operate within its boundaries, the dance houses on Gallatin Street were forced out of business. A few decades later, the writer Lyle Saxon walked the street and found it quiet, almost haunted, occupied by vegetable vendors serving the nearby French market. The most dangerous street in America had become a produce aisle. The Civil War ended the cotton boom and began the quarter's long economic decline. The antebellum Creole families, the ones who had attended the Opera House and promenaded on Royal Street, began moving out, first to Esplanade Avenue, then uptown. Into their vacated mansions came waves of Sicilian immigrants, driven by famine from southern Italy and drawn by the port's need for cheap labor. By the 1890s, the grand Creole houses had been carved into crowded tenements. Vegetable carts lined the streets. The quarter's population grew even as its wealth evaporated. And the vice that had always been present in pockets, Gallatin Street, the docks, began to spread. By the late 1880s, prostitution had become so pervasive across the city that the public outcry forced politicians to act. Their solution was distinctly New Orleanian. Instead of eliminating the problem, they would organize it. On January 29, 1897, Alderman Sidney Story introduced Ordinance Number 13,032, which forbade prostitution in New Orleans outside of a tightly defined district bounded by Custom House Street, now Iberville, Basin, St. Louis, and North Robertson, 16 blocks just north of the French Quarter, bordering its edge along Rampart Street. Story was a reformer. He had studied the legalized red light districts of German and Dutch port cities and believed that confining the trade to one area would make it easier for police to regulate and would protect the rest of the city from its effects. The ordinance took effect on July 6, 1897. Prostitution was not legalized. It remained nominally illegal. But the wording was carefully crafted so that the trade could be tolerated and regulated within the designated blocks, while being actively suppressed everywhere else. Story was horrified when the district almost immediately acquired his name. The prostitutes themselves coined the nickname, sardonically, to deride the alderman who had corralled them. He had envisioned a bureaucratic containment zone. What he got was Storyville, the most famous red light district in American history, and the only one in the country operating under explicit municipal sanction. The district was positioned, whether by design or coincidence, at a strategic commercial intersection. The railroad along Basin Street delivered passengers almost to the doorsteps of the brothels. Visitors stepping off the train from Houston or Memphis or Chicago found themselves looking directly at a row of ornate mansions purpose-built for the sex trade. The Blue Books, annual directories published starting in 1901, sometimes called Guidebooks to Sin, listed the names, addresses, ages, and racial classifications of every prostitute in the district. W for white, C for colored, Octi for octoroon. They were sold at train stations and hotel lobbies. Storyville became, in the language of modern business, a vertically integrated entertainment district. It contained everything from lavish mansions to squalid one-room cribs. Rows of tiny rooms renting for as little as 50 cents, where women worked in shifts under conditions closer to indentured labor than employment. The cribs occupied the interior blocks. Basin Street, the showcase boulevard, was reserved for the mansions. At the top of the hierarchy sat the madams of Basin Street. The most notorious was Lulu White, born around 1868 on a farm near Selma, Alabama, though she would claim at various times to be from Jamaica, Cuba, or the West Indies. White arrived in New Orleans in the early 1880s as a sex worker, cultivated powerful political connections, and by the time Storyville opened, she was ready. She sank $40,000, roughly $1.3 million in today's money, into constructing Mahogany Hall, a 4-story towered mansion at 235 North Basin Street. It had marble floors, 15 bedrooms with private baths, 5 parlors, one entirely mirrored, walls and ceiling, an elevator built for 2, and a swirling main staircase. She arrayed herself in diamonds on every finger, up both arms, around her neck, earning the title Dime Monde. Jelly Roll Morton and Tony Jackson played piano in the parlor. White men from across the country came for the winter season, and Storyville actively positioned itself as part of New Orleans' emerging tourism economy. Mahogany Hall employed 40 women. The music that emerged from this world would reshape American culture. Buddy Bolden, King Oliver, Jelly Roll Morton, and others played in the brothels, saloons, and dance halls of Storyville and the surrounding blocks, forging the sound that would become jazz. The district did not invent jazz. The music had deeper roots in Congo Square, in brass bands, in churches. But it provided a dense ecosystem of nightly employment for musicians, and the collision of blues, ragtime, and European harmony in those rooms produced something genuinely new. Louis Armstrong grew up blocks from Storyville and absorbed its sonic world as a child. For 20 years, the district operated in plain sight, generating enormous revenue in liquor taxes, license fees, and the general commercial activity of a neighborhood dedicated entirely to entertainment. The city had little incentive to shut it down. Then, America entered the First World War. In April 1917, the federal government prohibited open prostitution within 5 miles of any military base. 4 soldiers were killed in separate incidents in Storyville within weeks of each other. Major Bascom Johnson, counsel to the American Social Hygiene Association, visited New Orleans and bought a map drawn to scale demonstrating that the Naval Station, Jackson Barracks, and the new Naval Training School were all within 5 miles of the district. Mayor Martin Bierman traveled to Washington to argue that scattering prostitutes across the city like buckshot would only make surveillance harder. His persuasion bought a few more months. But on September 24, 1917, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels wrote directly to Governor Ruffin Pleasant and Mayor Bierman, making clear that if the city did not close Storyville, the Army and Navy would close it themselves. Bierman tried to fight. He argued before federal officials that New Orleans had been making a tidy profit from the district. License fees, taxes on purchases, levies on the liquor that flowed through the richer houses, and that closing it would scatter the problem, not solve it. You can make it illegal, but you can't make it unpopular, he reportedly said. He lost. The residents were given 30 days' notice. The district closed at midnight on November 12, 1917. It was a Tuesday, Mardi Gras day of the week, though not the season. The Times-Picayune reported the next morning that the houses, which had for many years been used for immoral purposes, would no longer be so used. An editorial cartoon in the New Orleans Item showed a police officer chasing the devil out of Storyville with a billy club. "Fini," read the caption. On the streets of Basin and Custom House, women loaded furniture onto carts and left, some for other parts of the city, some for other cities entirely, some into obscurity. The closure uprooted roughly 2,000 women. Lulu White kept Mahogany Hall open for a time, was arrested on federal charges a year later, and was told by the judge that if she sold the brothel, he would show leniency. She opened a saloon on Bienville Street, was repeatedly charged with violating the Volstead Act during Prohibition, sold the property in 1929, and vanished from public life. A jazz historian believed she died in 1931 at the home of a former madam named Willie Piazza. But a bank teller at the National Bank of New Orleans reported that White made a withdrawal in 1941. No one is certain what became of the Diamond Queen. King Oliver left for Chicago within months. Jelly Roll Morton headed to California. Freddie Keppard settled in Chicago. Kid Ory went to Los Angeles. The musicians scattered north and west, carrying jazz with them. The buildings of Storyville stood empty or repurposed for decades until, following the passage of the 1937 U.S. Housing Act, the city raised nearly all of them to build the Iberville Public Housing Project. Mahogany Hall, the $40,000 palace that Lulu White had filled with mirrors and diamonds, served as a house for the unemployed in the mid-1940s before it was demolished in 1949. It sold in 1929 for $11,000. Today, only 3 original Storyville structures still stand. But the vice didn't disappear. It migrated. When Storyville closed, the action shifted first to the Tango Belt on North Rampart Street. Then, after police raids in the 1920s, increasingly to Bourbon Street itself. And here the story takes its strangest turn, because Bourbon Street, the street the entire world now associates with New Orleans nightlife, was, for its first 2 centuries, nothing special. It was laid out in 1722 as one of the original streets of the French colony, named for the ruling family of France. And for 150 years, it was no fancier or rowdier than any other street in the quarter. The one notable exception was the French Opera House at the corner of Toulouse, which opened in 1859. But other streets had equivalent attractions. Bourbon was residential, mixed in class and race, and predominantly Creole. Then, on December 4th, 1919, the French Opera House burned to the ground. Lyle Saxon, writing in the Times-Picayune the next day, captured the grief of a city that had lost its cultural heart. There is a pall over the city. Eyes are filled with tears, and hearts are heavy. The heart of the old French quarter has stopped beating. Philanthropist William Ratcliffe Irby had acquired the building, which he donated to Tulane University, but the fire ended any plans for its future. The site would eventually become a Sheraton hotel. With the Opera House gone and Storyville shuttered, the quarter's identity, what it was for, who it belonged to, was suddenly open. The answer that emerged was Bourbon Street, and the transformation happened in stages. During the 1920s and 1930s, nightclubs began opening along the Strip. Hypolite Hype Ginley, a boxing promoter, opened the famous Door in 1936, naming it after the swanky Manhattan night spot that Louis Prima had made famous. Then World War II brought waves of soldiers and sailors through the port, and the nightclub economy exploded. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Bourbon Street was being heralded as the entertainment capital of the most interesting city in America. Along a 5-block stretch, over 50 acts could be seen on any given night. Burlesque dancers backed by live house bands, comedians, risque singers, contortionists. The clubs gleamed with neon as barkers out front enticed passers-by. The Show Bar, which opened in 1948, featured Kitty West, known as Evangeline the Oyster Girl, who emerged from a giant oyster shell to jazz accompaniment and danced with a pearl the size of a volleyball. Blaze Starr, the queen of burlesque, performed up and down the Strip and famously conducted an affair with Louisiana Governor Earl Long. Leon Prima's 500 Club, the Casino Royale, the Silver Frolics. The names alone suggest a world of sequined glamour. The performers became celebrities. Lily Christine, billed as the Cat Girl, was known for her sinuous feline style. Callantan was the Heavenly Body. Alouette LeBlanc was the Tassel Twirler. Evangeline the Oyster Girl took an axe to the water tank of a rival performer named Divina the Aqua Tease, and a photographer from Life magazine happened to capture the attack, publishing the photos nationally and generating more publicity than any advertising budget could have bought. The performers' feuds, staged or real, were covered in the newspapers as though they were society events. Blaze Starr's affair with Governor Earl Long became a national scandal, and she survived it better than he did. Burlesque was so profitable that some former music venues converted entirely to floor shows. At the peak, the 5-block Strip was generating enough revenue to support live house bands in every club. Trumpets, trombones, rhythm sections playing behind dancers 6 nights a week. But the glamour was underwritten by something less photogenic. Many of the clubs were profitable only because organized crime ran extensive illegal gambling operations in the back rooms and padded their take with bee-drinking schemes, in which dancers lured marks into buying wildly overpriced drinks. Drunk tourists were routinely rolled in the alleys behind the clubs. Country girls, hired as bee girls or dancers, sometimes found themselves pulled into the sex trade. The street was strictly segregated. Black performers could entertain on Bourbon, but the audiences were white, and musicians were generally treated as hired help, waiting in storerooms between sets. Then came Jim Garrison. Elected district attorney in 1962, Garrison recognized that burlesque clubs were expensive operations with large staffs and could only turn a profit if they ran illegal activities on the side. By cracking down on the gambling, the bee drinking, and the prostitution in the back of the house, he made the legal but costly entertainment in the front of the house financially untenable. Clubs closed left and right during 1962 and 1963. The great burlesque queens of the 50s did not survive the transition. What replaced them was cheaper to operate. Tawdry strip joints, peep shows, junk shops, sidewalk beer stands. The live house bands disappeared, replaced by records and, eventually, DJs. Hippies and rubes began to outnumber couples on fancy dates. Bourbon Street had been remade once more, this time not as a place of elaborate, if illicit, entertainment, but as an open-air drinking corridor for a mass tourism economy that was just arriving. While Bourbon was descending, the quarter itself faced an existential threat from a different direction entirely. In 1946, the Louisiana Highway Department had hired Robert Moses, the titanic New York builder whose highways had already gutted entire neighborhoods in his own city, to study New Orleans traffic and propose solutions. Moses recommended an elevated 6-lane expressway along the riverfront directly in front of Jackson Square. The plan called for the highway to run from Elysian Fields Avenue along the Mississippi, 40 feet high and 108 feet wide, past the Pontalba buildings and the cathedral, then descend into a tunnel at Canal Street to connect with the Greater New Orleans Bridge. A small piece of the highway, a 6-lane tunnel under the Rivergate Convention Center, was actually built before the rest was stopped. That tunnel is now used for valet parking at Harrah's Casino. The fight against the expressway lasted 2 decades. The mayor, the city council, the Times-Picayune, the Chamber of Commerce, and most of the business community supported the highway, arguing that passing up federal money, which would cover 90% of the cost, would only accelerate the growth of Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta. 2 young Tulane law graduates, Richard Bombach and Bill Bora, led the opposition, mounting a campaign that began with weekend flyers and escalated to anti-expressway banners hung from French Quarter balconies during Mardi Gras 1967 to attract national reporters. Elizabeth Werline had already helped win the creation of the Vieux Carré Commission in 1936, when Louisiana voters approved a state constitutional amendment protecting the quarter's historic character, only the second such preservation district in the country after Charleston. Now, a new generation marshaled that precedent against the highway. On July 1, 1969, Federal Secretary of Transportation John Volpe canceled the expressway, acknowledging it would have seriously impaired the historic quality of the French Quarter. It was the first segment of the interstate highway system ever canceled for environmental reasons. Bora called it miraculous. But while the Riverfront Expressway was defeated, a related plan, an elevated highway along North Claiborne Avenue, had already gone forward, tearing through historically African-American neighborhoods. The quarter was saved. The neighborhoods bordering it were not. What the preservationists saved, though, was already changing in ways they hadn't anticipated. The quarter's residential population had been declining for decades, but the decline was masked by a cultural renaissance that made the neighborhood feel more alive than it had in years. In the 1920s, roughly 20,000 people lived there. Sicilian families in the lower quarter, bohemian artists and writers drifting through cheap flats on Chartres and Dauphine, where rent was low and landlords asked few questions. William Faulkner wrote his first novel, Soldier's Pay, at 624 Pirates Alley in 1925, looking out at the garden behind St. Louis Cathedral. Sherwood Anderson lived on Pontalba Place and helped the young Faulkner find a publisher. Tennessee Williams arrived in 1938, took a room at 722 Toulouse Street, and eventually set a streetcar named Desire in the neighborhood. The apartment Blanche Dubois visits is in the Mahogany, just past the quarter's downriver edge. Truman Capote described the Pontalba apartments as somberly elegant. By 1960, with traditional jazz in commercial decline, a venue called Preservation Hall opened on St. Peter Street to provide a space for older, largely African-American musicians. Sweet Emma Barrett, the Humphrey Brothers, Billy and Day Day Pierce, who had been playing the music since the Storyville days. It charged no cover and sold no liquor. You stood or sat on the floor and listened. The quarter in those years was still, despite everything, a genuine neighborhood. Groceries, laundries, families, old women on stoops, the smell of red gravy from Sicilian kitchens mixing with the sound of a trumpet from an upstairs window. By the 1980s, the tourism economy had begun to consume it. The 1984 World's Fair turned the quarter into a destination on a scale it hadn't been before, and the city, increasingly dependent on hospitality revenue, leaned into the transformation. Hotels proliferated, restaurants multiplied, souvenir shops replaced groceries. Then came the short-term rentals. In 2015, there were fewer than 2,000 Airbnb-type listings in the city. By 2018, more than 6,500. Investors bought houses, converted them to weekend rentals, and entire blocks shifted into something closer to unofficial hotels. The City Council banned most short-term rentals in the quarter in 2019, but the damage had already compounded over decades. The population had fallen from 20,000 in the 1920s to roughly 4,000. Hurricane Katrina in August 2005 largely spared the quarter's buildings. The high ground that Bienville chose in 1718 proved its worth once more, but devastated the surrounding city and displaced the workforce that kept the neighborhood functioning. A scaled-back Mardi Gras was held in February 2006, drawing an estimated 700,000 people, and for a while, the quarter became a strange island, physically intact, historically gorgeous, surrounded by miles of ruined neighborhoods where the water had risen to the rooftops. Low housing prices after the storm drew investors who bought properties and converted them into short-term rentals, accelerating the transformation. Tourism recovered, then plateaued. The hospitality industry, by some measures, never fully recovered from the pandemic that came 15 years later. A cruel irony for a neighborhood whose entire economy had been restructured around the assumption that visitors would always come. On New Year's Day 2025, a man drove a pickup truck through 3 blocks of Bourbon Street, killing 14 people and injuring dozens more. The street was closed, then reopened the next day to a thin, somber crowd. Steel bollards were installed. Security zones were designated. The French Quarter went on, as it always does, but with a new layer of fortification visible on its already ancient streets. The iron balconies that the Baroness Pontalba introduced in 1849 still run the length of Jackson Square. They are, in a strict architectural sense, neither French nor especially old. Most of the ironwork visible in the quarter dates from the 19th century, and the buildings behind it were built by Spanish authorities after French buildings burned down. Below the balconies, 10 million tourists a year now pass through streets that once housed Creole cotton merchants, Sicilian vegetable vendors, Storyville madams, burlesque queens, and jazz musicians who changed American music before anyone thought to record them properly. The population has declined by 80% in a century. The buildings are preserved. What lived inside them is mostly gone. At the corner of Basin and Iberville, where the trains once delivered passengers to the doorstep of Storyville, where Lulu White stood in the doorway of Mahogany Hall wearing diamonds on every finger, there is today a modest intersection near a public housing redevelopment. No plaque marks where the $40,000 mansion stood. A few blocks away, at the corner of Bourbon and Toulouse, where the French Opera House once rose like a colossus, and where Lyle Saxon wept in print for the heart of the old quarter, there is a 4 Points by Sheraton. The street outside is loud at night. The balconies above are beautiful, and they belong to no one in particular.